Welcome. I'm Giovanni Zanalda, the director of the Duke Center for International Global Studies, and I'm introducing the webinar for today. The webinar, Anticipatory Diplomacy, a Modern Framework to Address Global Challenges, is organized by the Duke Center for International Global Studies Rethinking Diplomacy Program, which we started 2 years ago, precisely 2 years ago in January 2020. And we started with a lecture by Ambassador Bob Pearson, who is going to lead the conversation today. And 2 years later, we are here to rethink about what we have been doing and to concentrate on the concept of anticipatory diplomacy. We are joined by two distinguished guests, Ambassador Marcie Ries. She's a former senior fellow at the Welfare Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School, former US ambassador to Bulgaria, and former US ambassador to Albania. Ambassador Ries has been rethinking about diplomacy a lot throughout her career, and more recently in co-editing a document on the future of US diplomacy. And so she's definitely vested in this idea of the future of diplomacy. Dr. Lyndsey Gray, she's the chair of the National Science Policy Network, the NSPN Diplomacy Committee. She's a Science Diplomacy Exchange and Learning Fellow, still part of the NSPN. And she's a microbiologist, and she has been collaborating with us and through her network on ideas about science diplomacy. And we are certainly collaborating on projects that bring together the concept of diplomacy, science, and technology. Anticipatory diplomacy, Ambassador Bob Pearson will introduce the concept, and will start the conversation that then Ambassador Ries and Dr. Gray will provide some comments. And meanwhile, throughout the webinar, I will collect questions through the Q&A function, and I will ask the questions on behalf of the attendees to our speakers. Ambassador Pearson is a fellow at the Duke University Center for International Global Studies, Rethinking Diplomacy Program, former Director General of the US Foreign Service, former US Ambassador to Turkey, and he has been writing in different newspapers, magazines, journals about diplomacy and about these new concepts about diplomacy. So Ambassador Pearson, please welcome, and thank you again for being one of our leaders in this adventure.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, and welcome to our audience today. Very happy that you could join us, and hope that you will be able to make your own contribution through questions and comments during the course of the webinar. So let me talk today about a better model for modern diplomacy. We call this the anticipatory diplomacy model. It takes on a number of complicated multilateral issues, partners science and diplomacy together, adopts a collaborative stakeholder approach to resolving issues, and looks farther ahead than we do today to anticipate issues that are going to be crises if we don't act. So why do we need to take this kind of approach? I think that to start with, for Americans today, we face a number of daunting challenges. Young Americans who came of age in the 21st century have never actually known a time of peace and tranquility. 9/11 was followed by 4 Middle East wars that have not added to America's power and influence. There was the Great Recession of 2008. And from that widespread unemployment arose the long simmering resentment of the American middle class about their purchasing power and their loss of confidence in a better life for themselves and their children over a period of 5 decades since 1970. And then that sentiment in turn fed on the slow but rather general loss of trust in American government since the Vietnam War among the American people. So for many Americans, if what they had been hearing wasn't working, then what they had not been hearing, a proliferation of conspiracy theories, seemed to some like the road back to making America great again. And so seeing America pulling back from the world and divided, China announced that it would replace us as the preeminent nation on earth. And in that same period of confusion and following its own historical dream, Russia now is trying to claw back the countries that the Soviet Union lost when it dissolved, the countries of Eastern Europe. So the great game is back with us, and it may be with us indefinitely. Around the world in our environment, long ignored climate change now is producing more storms, more fires, more floods than ever before, even as the earth continues to warm and the seas continue to rise. We have a pandemic unknown for a century that's already killed millions, and we still don't actually know what the final effective response will be to that concern. Space is today's new Wild West, with essentially unlimited competition among state and private actors. And right in front of us are these immediate major crises. For the first time in 3/4 of a century, a European country is threatening to invade another independent European country. Europe seems uncertain about its direction, and Europe seems uncertain about American direction and resolve at the same time. China's emphasis on cutting-edge technology seems to have put America on the defensive. There are more refugees now than ever before, and they are seeking better lives anywhere they can reach. Human rights are yielding to genocide, supply chains are hobbled, food shortages and famines are looming, democracy is shrinking, and proto-democracies are embracing authoritarianism. So our present plate is already full. We do have some really terrific models of success. All of those models of success in diplomacy and global diplomacy have pushed back the risk of confrontation in their areas, and they have increased the chances for stability and peace. And many of them, of course, are having lasting impact, even if they're not well known or visible. No treaty is ever perfect. All treaties have to keep up with the times in order to survive, and all treaties leave some gaps that have to be solved later. But let me just list a few. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 removed an entire continent from the zone of conflict. Today, it has 50 members of the treaty, and those 50 members represent 2/3 of the world's population. Nuclear and non-nuclear weapons limitation treaties have reduced the number of nuclear weapons on Earth since they came into effect, and they provide a framework for other measures to limit arms when they are effectively used. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits claims of sovereignty on celestial bodies, the orbiting of Earth, weapons of mass destruction, stationing of such weapons on celestial bodies or anywhere in space, and they prohibit military installations and maneuvers on celestial bodies. China, Russia, and the United States are all members of the Outer Space Treaty, and yet we are seeing issues today mainly coming from the commercial sector and to some extent from the state sector that were not anticipated by that treaty. The Law of the Sea Treaty in 1982 establishes a framework that regulates all maritime and marine activities on the high seas and in areas of the oceans near national states. The Arctic Council formed in 1996, creates a framework that allows the United States and other Arctic nations to address environmental issues and sustainable development in the Arctic, again, as a framework for solving problems when the parties wish to take advantage of it. So the UN actually has more than 560 bilateral treaties that are in its depository. And every year, the United States adds international agreements that protect American interest and advance American opportunities. So I've just given you a sampling of really a rich, vast web of understandings that already exist that control, that guide, and encourage international cooperation. And these are key resources already at our disposal. The methodology of Duke's Rethinking Diplomacy Program builds on the experience behind those treaties. When this program began 2 years ago, in January of 2020, we had 3 objectives in mind. 1, to define the role of diplomacy to take on more complicated multilateral issues that require specialized knowledge. 2, to create a genuine science diplomacy partnership to tackle global challenges. And 3, to employ a model of collaborative stakeholder diplomacy multilaterally and at multiple levels to reach durable responses to crises. So in short, more diplomacy in more complicated situations, more science in that diplomacy, and more diplomacy in that science, and a model that welcomes the diversity of views combined with a consensus to reach a solution together. So this represents the basic floor on which today's comments are being made. You know, the core axiom of good diplomacy is that cooperation can provide benefits to all participants and can establish a framework that of trust and stability that encourages economic development, social protection, and protects, of course, national security. And countries that exhibit that trust in international relations create influence that do not draw directly from their military strength and do not draw directly from any ability to compel outcomes by pressure and force. And so what is, for me at least, very interesting about all of these agreements and all of this history of success is that every single one of them has combined these 2 key components of good science and good diplomacy acting together. And it's been one of America's abiding strengths, even before America rose to its global status after World War II, to have and exhibit its soft power. There was the revolutionary idea that democracy was superior to monarchy, and that transformed Europe and the Americas and is a substantial principle of international life today, even if it's not a reality everywhere. Soft power has lowered in the priority in American diplomacy since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and especially during the period of the Middle East wars that followed. But now really it's a time for soft power to play a new role, not just as a cultural tool, but actually as an avenue of scientific and technological influence. I can hardly think of a problem today, global problem, that does not have science and technology as a critical component to its solution. And in fact, the success of America has been the success of its science in energy, in health, in communications, in the internet, and in space exploration. So if we ever stop and just think about it, we actually are in the process of transforming the world at many levels, not with a direct application of military power, but with the manifestation of our indirect power. So for diplomacy and science to work well together today and effectively, we have to now reach out further to examine a series of consequences, a series of consequential issues that are going to be crises if we don't tackle them now. On January 1, in Foreign Policy magazine, we had an article asking for a space summit in 2022 to attract attention to these space issues. It was the lead article that day, the first day of 2022. The movement of peoples around from their countries of birth to other countries is increasing, and it's going to continue to increase. There is still no effective machinery or policy in place globally to deal with the next pandemic, frankly, or even with the next variants if they are more dangerous or more contagious than the ones we've already encountered. The transition from fossil fuels to new forms of energy is within our sights, but it lacks strategic direction, depending a great deal on initiatives that are being taken by private enterprise around the world. And in climate change, we need now to look beyond what we see are going to be the impacts of climate change, the damage that's going to happen that we can't stop today, to understand what are the consequences of those facts and how to deal with them. And in the development world, we need to also look to see what that will be like after the pandemic and after the global climate change impacts, in order to spur the global South to help close the gap with the global North, and especially to direct more attention to the rapid growth that's going on in Africa today. We have geographies on Earth, finally, that are not under sovereign control or quasi, or only partially under sovereign control. The Arctic Ocean, the high seas, to mention the top two, and to some extent even Antarctica. And they're going to be facing increased competition for access and for resources. So how do we manage this task of modern diplomacy to anticipate and to deal better with these challenges? We are suggesting 5 achievable tasks. First, expand and coordinate more formally and structurally the research and policy dimensions within the whole of U.S. government, to look 5 to 10 years ahead with each agency's perspective on its issues, so that we can begin to look at them holistically within the government. Secondly, tighten the bond between science and diplomacy. Let diplomats engage earlier on issues where science is key. Thirdly, reestablish the diplomacy and science career track at the Department of State and the Foreign Service, with positions at every level of authority, from entry level to an undersecretary for science and diplomacy, to help the United States more formally and more structurally engage with the world in its international environment on these issues. Fourth, bring in more participants from outside the government in working group formats, not continue the practice entirely of today, in which lobbyists and special interest groups and people with particular concerns come to individual agencies and try to affect policy that way. Put all of these people in the same room from time to time on a periodic basis. Let's listen to all of them talk across each other. And therefore, we think we could improve the policy formation process, and we could certainly learn more about how the players themselves see the broader picture in light of what others are doing. Finally, go global. Take this model and in dialogue with other countries, like-minded countries, encourage the consolidation of expert and policy coordination among these like-minded countries. We practitioners all know that good science and good diplomacy is based on good intelligence. So much of what I have been referencing to you in summary in this short talk is reflected also in the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends Report published in March of 2021. And it's entitled, quote, "A More Contested World," unquote. But I'd like to share with you one key statement in that report. And I think it reflects our view as well. It goes like this: the scale of transnational challenges and the emerging implications of fragmentation are exceeding the capacity of existing systems and structures. Of the 5 scenarios that the Global Trends Report outlines that would be possible in their considered views for 2040, 1 is optimistic, the resurgence of democracies. 2 are realistic. They are both patterns for relations between China and the United States. 1, a kind of peaceful coexistence option, and the other, a more combative and confrontational option. And the last 2 of those 5 scenarios are radical and they are dire. So the dystopian choices that are described in that report alone should convince us about the urgency of the work we have ahead of us. Of course, we're going to be tested on our resiliency and our adaptability, because we in America are going to be contested. The rest of the world is going to be contested as well. The countries, the communities, the states, and the institutions that share our views and our perspectives are going to be our partners. And successful resiliency measures that come out of those conversations will lead us toward a more sustainable, stable, and safe international order and climate environment. We all know that the United States can be and must be a leader in this process, but it can't be the only leader. Partnership and collaboration with other countries will improve our chances collectively for success. The model that we're describing and the steps to be taken now to make that model more effective present us with a clear and certain opportunity. The countries that organize regionally and globally together will be the most resilient. And the countries that perform that process together will be most likely to help achieve global sustainability. So as I close, I'd like to just remind us of something, and that is that at every key juncture in American history, our nation has faced an existential question of survivability. The American Revolution, saving the Union, saving democracies against imperial overreach in World War I, saving the world from fascism in World War II, and bringing the Cold War to a successful and peaceful close at the end of the 20th century. And I know that Americans have often been viewed as lacking by others around the world. Our mistakes are always visible. We're easy to critique. But if we do what we actually do know how to do best, which is to take a longer, more inclusive, more integrative, more globally collaborative approach, then we can surmount the problems we face today and tomorrow, just as we have solved many other problems in the past. So let me say at the end exactly what I said at the beginning. The broader and more frequent use of diplomacy in multilateral settings, the partnership of good science and good diplomacy, the use of the collaborative multi-stakeholder process, and the expanded foresight to see what is coming and to prepare for it is our proposal for facing this uncertain future with confidence. And that is what we call anticipatory diplomacy. So thank you very much for listening to these opening remarks, and look forward to the discussion and to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson, and thank you for this overview and introducing the concept of anticipatory diplomacy. Now, I would like to ask Ambassador Ries to provide her remarks, comments, and again, as I mentioned before, Ambassador Ries is in a perfect position to understand these type of issues that Ambassador Pearson described. And I know that she's also working on the diplomacy project phase 2, so which builds on her previous work for the diplomacy project phase 1. So Ambassador Ries, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Duke for inviting me to be with you today. I want to depart from Bob's really wonderful strategic commentary here and talk a little bit about how these ideas and this approach appeals to me as a practitioner. The intersection of diplomacy and science, I can't say enough about how important that really is. In my own experience, for example, negotiating the New START treaty, one of the very first things we did, of course, was look at what our negotiating position was going to be. And from the very start, we had a nuclear scientist sitting right with us in the State Department in Washington to talk about the concepts on which our position would be based. It was so, the science was so clearly important that the entire negotiating team, before we ever encountered the Russians, toured the American nuclear infrastructure and met with our scientists at the all-important labs. So there is, I think, in a very practical way, critical collaboration between scientists and diplomats to our great advantage in a negotiation of that type. Science can also be a bridge in diplomacy. At difficult moments in our history, U.S. and, for example, then Soviet scientists still got together, talked to each other, and it was one arena in which we could get out of the political frame and talk about areas that we had in common. Science is a very important part of our soft diplomacy. Bob alluded to this. Now, even as recently as a couple weeks ago, we had an astronaut touring Europe, and that really captures people's imagination and is a very important part of the whole appeal of America. And that is, of course, the essence of soft power. Science is, of course, increasingly important. In our project, the American Diplomacy Project, one of the reasons why we undertook it in the first place was because it seemed to us that the problems that America is facing today are very much problems that we need diplomacy to solve. They aren't really susceptible to military solutions. I'm talking here about pandemics, about cyber issues, and Bob alluded to what I would call new frontiers, space, the Arctic. All of these are problems of diplomacy, but they have very important scientific components. So I think this initiative to look at how we can better collaborate between science and diplomacy is extremely timely because it addresses the very big problems that we're facing today. That said, looking forward is hard. In a race between strategic thinking and operational thinking, very often we go for the operational because it's the necessity. It's the thing that we have to do. That said, one of the things that we recognize in our American Diplomacy Project is that strategic thinking is a must for our diplomats today for all the good reasons that Bob highlighted in his very interesting remarks. We really must take a strategic perspective, and one of the recommendations that we made was that we do a lot more training of our diplomats to think strategically. So the idea of anticipatory diplomacy seems to me to be a good idea, but I think that it has to be, in order for us to find a model, to use it for the most critical problems that face us today. I think the sort of working group model is probably the most likely to succeed, and which has succeeded in the past. I'm thinking here of the Marshall Plan and of the Manhattan Project, for example, where we bring together a lot of different elements of government to deal with a single problem. But I think in order to make that happen in our big government with so many agencies, you really have to have a compelling reason. At the end of World War II, the compelling reason was the post-war world. So I think you have to, in order to make that really move forward and really get the full participation of all of our agencies, you really have to have a compelling reason. The partnership with scientists can certainly help us to scan the horizon. I noticed this really useful phrase in some of the projects that you've been working on, and I think that's a very good idea. And the study that Bob mentioned on future thinking, which is done by the CIA, is very useful and in this regard. But I think we really have to discipline ourselves to think about that and to step back from all the problems of today, this minute, and keep our eyes on the horizon, because that's where some of our biggest challenges are coming from today. So I guess I'll circle back to where I started, which was that we do need to look for very effective ways to collaborate, and now even more than times than in the past, between scientists and diplomats. And so I think the way that you're pursuing this is extremely useful and really shows us a path where we can do better in the future.
Thank you, Ambassador Ries. And now I would like to ask Dr. Gray to provide her remarks. I want just to mention that it's great to have not only a scientist on board in this case, but she represents a large group of young scientists around the US and who are also connected to international scientists. And so she will provide a different perspective, and she can also share with all of us the enthusiasm among these young scientists who are interested in public policy in general, but also in diplomacy. Dr. Gray.
Well, thank you so much. I would love to echo Ambassador Ries's enthusiasm for being here. It is a joy to speak with all of you today. And I'd like to follow up on Bob's original comments and also Ambassador Ries's mention of these collaborative groups that are inherent to anticipatory diplomacy. So when I think of this phrase, anticipatory diplomacy, what I think of is boldly thinking of future solutions that also include a high degree of resiliency and sustainability. We need solutions that are not just going to address future problems, but will also stand the test of time in the years to come. Now, in recent years, I am going to cite a couple of studies that have recently come out. I wouldn't be a scientist if I don't reference studies, but we've seen all sorts of research coming out across multiple career sectors, healthcare, business, and engineering, that illustrate that when you have multidisciplinary teams that include various career stages, areas of expertise, and importantly, too, life experiences. So matters related to a person's personal background, where they are coming from, their own cultural sources of knowledge. Results from those teams are overall more innovative, they're more effective, and they're bolder. So when we think about some of these looming future problems that both Ambassador Ries and Ambassador Pearson have mentioned, those are the types of solutions that we need. And what I personally believe very strongly is when we think about those interdisciplinary teams, scientists need to be one of those members that are at the table. I'm not arguing that every single person needs to be a scientist. Again, the key is multidisciplinarity. But what I want to really highlight from my own background are the qualities that scientists bring to the table that I believe will help America bring forth a more strategic and effective diplomacy in the years to come. So, of course, the easy answer here is that scientists have a high degree of expertise. When you think about what it takes to craft a scientist, they are spending years of their life pursuing a question that is inherently rooted in the unknown. They are given something that has never really been truly solved, and they are tasked over a long-term period of time to do their best to find answers. That takes an incredible degree of personal and institutional resiliency to address. And while that journey is inherently individualistic, it can't be done in isolation. Scientists have to work in teams in order to find solutions to these matters of discovery and unknown questions that are presented to them. I believe that's the type of framework that we need. We think about some of these larger looming problems that have been mentioned in today's conversation: climate change, the wellness of the ocean and outer space, future pandemics. Those are going to require a high degree of technical knowledge and also that sort of tenacious resiliency that scientists bring to that team set to resolve that problem. The second thing I want to mention is how scientists critically think in their argumentation strategies. I know, especially now with scientists really having the spotlight shown upon them in light of the pandemic and climate change in particular, we hear phrases like scientists have shown, scientists have proved. And while I'm not necessarily dissuading or showing that language is incorrect, it's really not how scientists argue and think. We don't really prove things. We just fail to disprove them. That is how scientific argumentation truly works at its core. And that's an important distinction, because what it essentially means is that every time we come up with an idea or a theory that explains how things work, we're not trying to prove that we're right. We are trying to come at that idea from every single angle and see if we can disprove it. And if we fail to do so, both on a personal level and through the series of checks and balances that we have through peer review, through being graded and judged by our peers and fellow experts, then we will say with confidence, we believe this to be true. What this means is that the ideas and the solutions that we propose, although maybe not perfect, are inherently rooted in sustainability. We've already tried to attack it from every angle that we can think of. And being able to come forward with those types of solutions, especially with some of the very daunting problems that we have today, I believe will hopefully revolutionize some of the ways that we are conducting policy in the future. The last thing I want to emphasize with scientists is that, yes, we are very realistic. And our entire career is based on trying to explain how reality works. we can't do that without being inherently optimistic too. We are built for failure. We are so used to having everything that we try very hard to work on failing 100 times before we get it to work. And we can't really survive in that type of career space if we don't inherently believe that one day we will make it possible. Some of the challenges that Ambassador Pearson mentioned at the beginning of his talk, I know have a tendency to make people feel very hopeless and can also make people of my generation in particular feel very apathetic. You know, what's the point of addressing these issues if history is only going to repeat itself, if we only find ourselves in another Cold War, if these issues are now so insurmountable? You know, what could one person, one individual action really do to resolve this? It can be easy to feel hopeless, but this is where I have faith in scientists, is our inherent ability to always believe that one day we will overcome things. That doesn't mean we are shy or unrealistic to the challenges that we'll take to get there. But that sense of optimism, I believe, needs to happen if we really are going to have a forward-thinking approach to the way that we conduct diplomacy without being lost in the process. The last thing I want to mention in my comments is there is perhaps no better time for scientists to step forward and to be welcomed into this framework of anticipatory diplomacy than now. We are facing an economic situation within the United States based on career choices, based on job availability. We have an interesting dynamic. One, we have multiple generations of people that perhaps have been the most highly educated in America's history. And two, they can't all stay in academia. There simply is not enough room for all of these scientists to remain tenured professors. And so they are actively looking because they are passionate about what they study, because they want to use the skills that they have been so hard to accumulate and apply those outside our university system. I can think of no better place for them to land than within the US diplomatic framework, whether that's directly within the federal government or in its supporting partners in industry and in non-government spaces. When we think about anticipatory diplomacy, I truly believe that scientists need to be one of those players that help push that framework forward. And the time to do that really could not be better than now.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And again, as I want just to echo the fact that you are, of course, in touch with many other young scientists who are thinking the same. And it's nice to know that there is this enthusiasm. Bob, would you like to comment? While I'm collecting also questions to the Q&A function, so please, if you have comments, questions, do submit them through the Q&A function. Thank you. Bob?
Thank you, Giovanni. I do have a comment, and I really appreciate what Ambassador Ries and Dr. Gray have said. And the thing that stood out for me is both of them emphasize the concepts of resiliency and sustainability. So it made me begin to think that, you know, if you turn literally everybody loose to imagine what the future would be, why you're just going to have a total cacophony of sounds that come back. But if you were to say, put the mold of resiliency measures leading to sustainability outcomes on top of that conversation when it's held in a disciplined way, so that you can't get away with talking about something that isn't going to work. I'll just give you one example. A brilliant researcher, I think at a university in England, has noticed that one of the huge ice shelves on the Antarctic continent might break off in the next years. And his solution is to put a net around it, a very expensive net. Well, as a layperson, I look at that solution, it sounds wonderful, but I can't imagine the cost and the feasibility of having it actually come into being. Maybe I'm completely wrong. I pick an example just to highlight the importance of resiliency and sustainability. So I'd be interested in hearing what Dr. Gray and Ambassador Ries say about using those as guardrails for the kind of conversation that we hope to have about what's happening in the future and coming at us.
Doctor, we also have, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that that it is today something that people are really talking about, sustainability, for example, and we're worried about water, food, climate, and the actual sustainability of populations. So I think that is very much a part of the conversation, and very much what we're talking about here, the intersection of strategic thinking and scientific thinking. So I think that is a very important part. It's particularly, I think, in the area of climate change that we need to think about it, and certainly we need to think about practical solutions, and that's part of the advantage of a multilateral framework. I want to point out here that there's a very big difference, not just in the forum, but in the skills and the type of diplomat you need to be successful in multilateral diplomacy, as opposed to bilateral, where I'm just talking to one other country. And I think these big problems that we're talking about are going to put us more and more in the multilateral forum. And that's good, because then we look at everything from a sort of 360 degrees, and we don't end up with a solution that sounds great, but probably can't be implemented.
Dr. Gray, do you have to comment on?
Yes, I will most certainly second all of those thoughts. Sustainability and resiliency, I believe you are correct, where those are usually terms that you hear most openly said when we think about climate-related science. But really, it's a framework that scientists inherently think about, regardless of their disciplines, regardless of whether they're in the hard sciences, or also importantly for this conversation too, the social and the soft sciences. When we're in an academic system, a lot of scientists are very frankly strapped for cash. So when we are thinking about the solutions that we propose, we're really trying to think of solutions that will stand the test of time, even with limited resources. Now, that's often a framework that we have to think about for just our own day-to-day operations. But perhaps on a positive note, that means that when we expand those types of solutions to the 10,000-foot view, to a more holistic approach, they also are able to resist some of the hurdles that are thrown their way. Now, what I also want to highlight with the example that you proposed is that we need to also, yes, think of bold solutions. Throwing a net around a shipping piece of an Arctic shelf is something that I can acknowledge sounds maybe a little bit like a science fiction or something you would see on a TV show that would come out on a weekend. But those types of bold thinking, the key that I know we need to learn also from diplomacy is, how do we ground those types of bold solutions into reality and make it seem like we aren't just shooting for the moon in a way that unnecessarily uses those resources that are so entrusted to us by the American public in particular. So what I'm really getting at here is that we really need to work with diplomats and policy professionals in particular to come up with those bold solutions and harness our inherent resiliency and sustainability in how we design and do projects in order to apply those to sectors that we aren't perhaps the most familiar with. So science expertise channeled through diplomacy is a model that I believe we truly need to follow.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And before we get to some of the questions, I would like to ask Dr. Schmidt, another scientist who is also part of the Rethinking Diplomacy Program, to make his comment on as a scientist.
Thanks, Giovanni, and thanks, Ambassador Ries, Ambassador Pearson, and Dr. Gray, all excellent comments. Frankly, I couldn't co-endorse everything you have all said more strongly than I do here. I want to just point out that from a standpoint of prioritization, when we think about anticipatory diplomacy, I think we're by definition thinking about encountering and and getting multidisciplinary solutions together and having multi-stakeholder approaches for horizontal issues, future issues. And that's, I think, why science and technology is so central to these sort of discussions, because when one thinks of the future, one often thinks of innovation. And so, a lot of these issues, whether it's, combating the climate crisis or future space security issues or telecoms, et cetera, we're really looking at, issues that need solutions now in order to move this forward in the future. But at the same time, it's also important to look at how those future crises actually reflect on, where we are in this trajectory for geopolitics today. I'll point to the economic sector, where a lot of our headline-grabbing issues that we see around the world today have this underlying tension between authoritarian nations investing in critical infrastructure in democratic systems, and what to do about that, and how to grapple that. And I think that it's always important to look at these from a diplomatic national security perspective, but also in almost all of these cases, and as Ambassador Pearson said at the very start, really have a core science and technology component of it. So whether we're talking about the impact on Russian energy infrastructure investments in Europe, or democratic systems, wrangling with the decision on whether to allow Huawei or other Chinese telecoms to invest in their 5G rollouts. These all really have a core science and technology component, and needs to be part of the analysis that leads to diplomatic decisions. What actually has a national security impact? What actually is core to that solution? That's where anticipatory diplomacy comes in so heavily, because we need to look at these issues right now and in the future at the same time. And that's basically my comment. And again, I thank you all for your excellent interventions today.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And I would like to ask a couple of questions from the attendees. Thank you for submitting your questions. The first two are related, so I will bring them together. The first one from George Sibley is: during the Cold War, we used to say that politics ended at the water's edge, meaning that there was a bipartisan agreement, largely, on our US international priorities, especially containment of the Soviet Union. How do we implement anticipatory diplomacy in a country riven by partisan differences without any international carve-out? And the second question, which is also connected: which countries are the least likely to engage in anticipatory diplomacy? Bob, if you would like to answer to this question.
I think that first question is an excellent one. And let me just turn it around. So you're going to stop trying to look ahead at future problems because our country is so divided? I mean, that for me is the fundamental question. And I looked at that as I thought about my remarks. I didn't go into it because to me, it's as if whether you're an optimist or a realist or just panicked by some of these issues, there's really no choice but to go ahead and try to devise these solutions. Second half of that response is there are a lot of like-minded countries around the world, and America's global success has been built from the beginning on our association with them. We're 5% of the world's population, and for Americans, 95% of our markets and investment opportunities, security problems lie overseas. So I understand the gravity of the current concern. I know exactly what you're talking about, at least from my perspective, but I think that it means that we have to see what we can do in international relations with like-minded countries to build the kind of consensus that shows that we can succeed in these problems, and that will help our domestic relationships and domestic atmosphere as well. Not trying to cop out on the question, but I think we have no choice. And I note the problem, but I think we need to just keep going, because otherwise we surrender to the people who are trying their best to make us weak.
Thank you. And another question, this is for Dr. Gray, but also for the other panelists, from Rachel George, who is also an international relations expert. Thanks so much for the wonderful discussion. Dr. Gray's comment about the limited jobs and resources in academia is so important. And there are also many limitations in terms of resourcing and creating adequate job opportunities for diplomatic work. Have any of the panelists seen any good solutions in terms of expanding and resourcing diplomacy as a sector? Dr. Gray, would you like to answer first, since you are also involved in some of these initiatives?
This is such a lovely question, and I really want to appreciate the speaker for asking this, because it's true, where I think we have some work to do on many different career sectors to formally institute and build the jobs that we are really trying to advocate for from scratch at this point. One of the things that we really talk about within my own community quite a bit, especially when we think about transitioning out of academia, is that the title science diplomat is really a self-appointed job description, that there isn't a business card that you're going to see handed to you by somebody else that says, Dr. such and such, science diplomat. That being said, I am optimistic that the opportunity here is that for innovative individuals, be they scientists or science-adjacent policymakers and foreign relations experts, to create those kind of communities for themselves. That is something that we try very hard to do with the National Science Policy Network, is to carve out that space to create a force within community that advocates for the eventual creation of those spaces, either within the government or their partnering sectors. So what I really am trying to emphasize here is that this is another area where we stay incredibly optimistic, that those spaces can be created through our own collaborative force of will, through our own shared expertise, as instead of necessarily relying on those positions to be generated for us. It's another reason why we are incredibly pleased with our work with Duke University in particular. That's how we legitimize these types of roles moving forward.
Thank you. And Dr. Ries, since you addressed some of these issues in the first report, and I'm sure that you are taking these issues in consideration in the phase 2, any advice or any comment on this?
Sure. Well, I think since immediately after 9/11, our country rightfully was very focused on counterterrorism and military hardware solutions to our problems and our difficulties, and the Congress was very willing, both parties more than willing, to finance that, to put the resources into it. But I think there is a general recognition that a lot of the problems that we face today must have diplomatic solutions. In fact, there's a famous remark by one of our generals that if you don't pay more for diplomacy, you'll have to buy me more bullets. And which is a very nice way of saying that you need to put more resources into diplomacy. And actually, in the past 2 years, the Congress has been very generous with us in funding the State Department in recognition of the need for a strong diplomacy. So I would say that may be one area where there actually is a feeling that transcends party and other divisions, that diplomacy is important and we need to support it. And that would certainly include science diplomacy.
Thank you. And I have a long question, but I think it's an important question, so I would like to read it. Maybe Bob or Ambassador Ries, if you'd like to comment on this. Do we need then a new diplomatic body, not only generational speaking, but post-ideologically speaking too, beyond the dualistic, good, bad, communist, capitalist, savage, civilized, etc., way that we had reduced much of the issues of the world in the past century? A diplomatic global body that are able to face global threats, climate, pandemic, environmental issues, space, etc., that create multi-nation, multidisciplinary, multi-species approaches, something beyond corporate, private, or political interests. If we reduce all to domestic security, economy, quality of life issues, there is no way to move forward. Has diplomacy been captured by nationalistic interest only? How do you see this new diplomat anticipating diplomacy? It's a complicated question, but Bob, would you like to comment on this?
It's a great question. It's a terrific question. First, I would say that we do have the United Nations and all its organizations which have provided marvelous information, research, observations, and discussions on many of these topics, and which are out there and which are part of what I would call the soft power atmosphere globally, which informs all of us. And of course, that includes the United States. The second question is, it's very important to recognize two things that sound contradictory but shouldn't be. One is that the ability to resolve problems does depend on your economic presence in the world. It does depend on your cultural influence in the world. It does depend on your ability to present the cogent argument and to unwind the Gordian knots with words. 99% of our problems are solved with words. So you have to have that experience, and it has to be connected to a state's presence in the world. Thirdly, you can't, and that's why in my comments, I specifically put very little emphasis on national security. Once you channel everything through a spectrum of national security, you wander into the realm of defense, deterrence, the exertion of power, compulsion, and so on as part of your solution, and it begins to dominate the discussion. Don't do that. Let's do it the right way, which is take diplomacy as the lead and let diplomacy lead to national security, not the other way around.
Thank you, Bob. And I would say last question, this could provide, especially Bob, Ambassador Pearson, a way to provide some examples of what we think about anticipatory diplomacy, whether it's space diplomacy or something else. So the question is, I now understand the importance of having collaboration and diplomacy between like-minded countries to solve very pressing problems in today's age. However, particularly with how contentious some nations can be today, how do you see us approaching and finding a solution in eventually collaborating and working alongside such nations in the future?
Actually, I will defer to Ambassador Ries on this, who has enormous experience in dealing with countries that are contentious over issues that are contentious. And then if there's time, I'll add a comment.
Well, I do think that collaboration, as Bob mentioned, with like-minded countries is very important, remains very important, and we're seeing it right now in the current crisis with Ukraine, where we have put a lot of emphasis on collaboration with our NATO allies and with our partners in Europe. And this is, I think, proven to be really the key to resolving the whole problem by diplomacy, which is the way that we're going with this. So this is a perfect example, and I want to put a pitch in for doing a better job of explaining to the American people what we are doing in diplomacy. It's certainly true that, for example, you brought up the United Nations, that there's really a lot going on, and much more that could be going on in that forum that could be very constructive. But we really need to make the case to the American people that that's important to us and that good solutions can be found there. Another example is the OSCE, an organization which many Americans have never heard of, 57 countries, I believe it is now. But it played a big role in the end of the Soviet Union. So collaborative diplomacy with like-minded countries is a really essential tool in the toolbox, and we need not only to use it more, which we seem to be doing now, but we really need to do a very good job of explaining to the American people that we have these tools, that they're useful, and that we are getting good results of using them.
If you don't mind, I
Yes,
hesitate to cut off potentially any comments from Ambassador Pearson, but since we are addressing this topic of countries in conflict versus countries that are in collaboration, I really want to emphasize that this can be a space where scientists in particular can be those tools of diplomacy and maintain channels of healthy communication between countries that maybe for whatever reason aren't able to speak through normal diplomatic channels at this point. And what I really want to emphasize as a great example of this is a yearly symposium called the Malta Conferences. So this is a conference system that was developed by Dr. Zafar Lerman. Basically, it is a scientific gathering of scientists from all across the Middle East every year. And oftentimes these countries are not exactly, during that moment of that conference, in perfect harmony with one another. But through these scientific exchanges, they're able to open and maintain channels of informal diplomacy and communication, allowing for agreements to arise in the future. So addressing this question, I really want to emphasize that in those moments where we are thinking about diplomatic similarity and just being able to have communications between different countries, this is a way that the United States and other countries could potentially lean on their scientific force as a tool for diplomacy and productive soft power.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. This was a perfect comment. Bob, would you like to, Ambassador Pearson, would you like to?
I completely agree. I think that it's important to keep in mind that what you hear on the media and in the news and newspaper every day is you hear about what Russia is doing, you hear about what China is doing. So you get the idea that somehow they're going to stop whatever we want to do. But in reinforcing others' remarks, you can't imagine what it means for like-minded countries to do something that sets a standard that holds other countries up to measure about whether they comply or not. The best example recently was something that we also published an article about. The Russians launched directly from a launching pad inside Russia into orbit a rocket that destroyed a very large Russian derelict satellite and sprayed space debris all over everywhere, endangering the space station itself. So that brought sharp attention to the fact that this is conduct that is completely unacceptable, and the world agreed. So the point is that this kind of informal and intelligent and collaborative conversation does make a difference in the way the world reacts to things. And if we're on the right side of those reactions, we have a much better chance of establishing that resiliency, leading to sustainability that we've talked about before. So in other words, as somebody else said a long time ago, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson. And in closing the event, first, I would like to thank our speakers again, but also all the attendees who are still here listening and asking questions. And I would like to mention that we have been providing practical examples of what we think about anticipatory diplomacy in several series that we have been organizing and writing about in the last 2 years. But we are also moving forward. We look forward, we look to the future, and we have more, not only webinars and events, activities for the spring semester, but also beyond that. And one in particular will involve space diplomacy. And so we will certainly advertise through different channels, but for those who participated today, if you are not already part of our mailing list, or if you want to get more announcements about anticipatory diplomacy, rethinking diplomacy, or space diplomacy as part of, or science diplomacy, or supply chains diplomacy. We have many, many different ways to address some of the issues that I just mentioned. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you also to Gianluca, Corinna, Daisy, and Ping for organizing this event. And thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for participating today. And we look forward to see you again. And thank you, and have a nice the rest of the day.